Okay, so we've got to that stage, and of course that's unrealistic because I've simply got the firms borrowing money but doing nothing with it. So what they're going to do in this model is hire workers, get the workers to work in factories, and I'm assuming the factories are there at the moment. I haven't yet modelled building the factories and so on. I'll add that later. But they're going to, of course, in that case, have to pay wages to workers to get workers to work in those factories. So there's now going to be wages. And that's going to be a transfer from the firm's account. Pardon me, the program unfortunately resorts columns. I don't want it to do that. I want it to be a case of saying assets minus liabilities equals equity, which is the basic equation of accounting. It's just shuffled around in alphabetical order. I'm stuck with that. That won't happen in the new version. Okay, so they transfer money from the firms and they pay it to the workers. And of course, once that's done, talking about the Wild West, they go off to the saloon to spend it. So there's consumption. And it isn't just the workers who consume, it's also the bankers. Now this consumption by the bankers can be buying intermediate inputs to run a bank as well as going off and going to the local whorehouse. We are talking the 19th century and we are talking bankers. Okay. Okay. So there's going to be money taken out from the workers. I'll start with the workers first. And that's going to be, and also money taken out of the safe. And that's going to be spent on the firms, both the hotel and the whorehouse. Hopefully also maybe the local store, you never know. Okay, so that's going to be D plus E over here. So let's save that.
Could you tell me that line again, please? No, I'm not sure why there's a D and an E.
Oh, the D, okay. D is the amount of money coming out of the workers' account and being paid for consumption.
Out of their wallet.
Okay. Pardon?
Out of their wallet.
Out of their wallet. They've got the notes, being paid their wages, off they go to the saloon or the local store, and the bankers have got their interest payments and off they go to the local whorehouse. Yeah? And those are some of the firms in this whole aggregation I'm calling the firm sector. So I've got to say what D...
E is the bankers spending money.
Yeah, D is the bankers... D is the workers spending money, and E is the bankers spending money, the way I put it into that model. I can use anything I like, by the way. I don't have to call it E or D. I could call that, I could say workers consume and bankers consume, but it makes the model easier to look at with a low resolution screen. So now I've got to define three new elements there, C, D and E. Well, C is the payment of wages. And I'm going to make wage payments proportional to the amount of money the firms have got in their firm's account. I'm going to define W later. Now that's the next thing is workers' consumption. Like say workers are going to consume at a rate proportional to the amount of money that's in their account at any particular time. So I'm going to call that WC, workers' consumption, and multiply that by what's in the workers' account at time T. And bankers, same sort of thing. I'm going to say bankers' consumption is going to be BC, constant, multiplied by what's in the safe, which is where the part of the system they can spend from legitimately. So having done all that, I now have to define what give values to WC and BC. So I'm going to make W 4. I'll explain that choice later. So say W is going to be equal to 4. WC, workers' consumption, is going to be equal to 26. I'll explain that in a second. And bankers' consumption I'm going to set equal to 1. I'll explain that in a moment as well. I've chosen those numbers. Let's just save it again. What these stand for is how often the particular social class turn over their accounts. If you think about workers, they get paid on a fortnight, they spend on a fortnight. That means they'll turn their accounts over about 26 times a year, hence I'm using 26 as the value there. Bankers who are wealthier, much more money, they can survive for a year without wiping out their bank account, so I use 1 as a rough idea for them. They're going to have a lower rate of consumption out of their accounts, even though they're spending, of course, more money than the workers because they're wealthier. So that's the reason for those values. I'm using, what I'd be properly using here is fractions of a year in what are called time constants, but that's a bit too complicated in terms of the explanation to an audience who's not used to those dynamic approaches. But that's where the values come from. So saying workers turn their accounts over 26 times a year, bankers turn their accounts over once, And the less rapidly you turn over the account, the wealthier you are. Hence the difference.
What's W4?
That's how much the firm's account is turned over annually, how often that's turned over in paying wages out. It's saying, and I'll go into more detail about how you're going to choose a value like for, but I can make it a smaller one. The system will still work, by the way. People often think that's not the case, but I'll show that later. So I've now really got the simplest, truly functional model. So I've got the bank lending money, charging interest on it, the firm sector paying interest on that debt, with the money it got from the loan hiring workers, producing goods, which is implicitly happening in the background, selling those goods to workers and bankers. Okay? No repayment of debt yet. So let's look at that model. Now they're all connected together, a bit messier. So there's recording the loan first of all, there's recording the payment, there's compounding the debt. Over here for the firms, we have consumption coming back to them from the other two social classes. They're paying interest over there, and they're paying wages to workers. Let's whack this up here somewhere. And workers are consuming as well. So I'll just save that. Now let's see what happens with this model. Now, notice last time when I didn't have workers being hired and then workers and bankers consuming, that the amount of money in the account of the firms went negative, which is what people think necessarily has to happen because you're being charged interest, you can't repay it, you're getting lent $100, you've got to pay $105, that way lies hell. Watch what happens to the accounts. The vault will still run down to 0, and the loans will still go to 100 because all the money gets lent out. But you'll notice the other two accounts start to stabilise. 3 accounts, pardon me. The amount of money in the firm's account is still going up. The amount of money the workers got is still rising. The safe is, of course, positive over here, but it's not going exponential as it did last time round. The workers have got money in their accounts now. The firms have got money in their accounts too. They owe a larger amount in debt than they actually have in cash. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. But their account will stabilise. They're managing to pay the interest. If you see the interest they're paying out here, that's showing the total amount they've paid so far. So they've got $81 in their account. They've paid $38 million so far in interest. How have they done that? Because you pay interest out of the circulation. Okay? And this is the confusion that makes people erroneously believe you can't repay whatever you get lent, because they're confusing a stock with a flow. Now the stock is, and you can work this out by saying what dimensions are applied to the variable you're looking at. When I say I'm going to lend you $100, what's the time dimension of the loan? The answer, there is none. I've given you $100, you owe me $100. Okay? So that is dimensioned by money alone. But then, of course, having given you the money, I now charge you interest. What's the time dimension of the interest? It's annual. I'm going to charge you 5% per year. So the payment of interest is dollars per year. So the first is a stock and the second is a flow. Now, how do you pay that flow? Well, you've got the money. You now have a certain amount of money in the economy. You then hire workers, produce output, sell the goods. You've therefore got a flow of profits being generated by that. And the scale of the flow depends upon how productive your economy is, how rapidly you turn that money over. That's where the W comes in. I've generated a fairly productive economy here. But the outcome, as you can see, I've been talking for long enough to become obvious. The amount of the money in the account stabilises. The firms are successfully paying the interest charge. They're not being sent bankrupt by doing it. But of course, I haven't got them paying loans back yet. So that's the final stage I need to go to show the system is inherently sustainable, even when you have to repay the debt, which people, again, have thought is not possible.
I think there's another assumption that you're glossing over, and that is that the bankers are spending their interest earnings.
Well, ultimately, bankers don't acquire the money to put it on the wall. They do try to accumulate as much as they can, and I haven't got them accumulating financial assets and speculating and gambling and all the stuff we know they do. Nor do I have the capitalists doing that. I haven't even separated capitalists out from the firm sector. I should really have a firm sector paying dividends to a capitalist class. Okay, and all that can be done quite easily. I'm just using...
I think it makes a big difference whether the bankers spend their interest earnings or lend them out.
Well, it does, because if you say the bankers simply don't... Well, actually, let's do that. Let's just stop this.
Before you go on to that,
Yeah,
three things. Okay,
yeah,
this model, before I've heard you call like a hydraulic model,
yeah,
because it's showing kind of like water in a municipal water system being pumped, but it's being pumped in a circuit.
yeah,
I mean, it doesn't come out a tap and go into the sewer and evaporate.
yeah, yeah,
It's just being pumped around.
yeah.
Okay. So that's why it looks like pumps and little basins.
Yep.
And the basins are like glasses of water that are getting filled up.
This is a tribute to Bill Phillips, because he actually, back in the 50s, tried to illustrate this sort of stuff to economists. He actually built two computer models of the economy, one a hydraulic computer and the other actual analog computer. Okay, way back, using resistors, valves back in those days, to build a model you could actually tweak and see it all happen on screen. You still couldn't get through to the economists.
Could you follow one Colorado dollar from the vault all the way through the circuit so we can just see how that dollar might travel?
I can't actually illustrate it in this software package, but you could. You could see it going through and continuing to circulate. And what people forget...
Up on the stage,
Pardon?
show us how $1 would...
Oh, well, I'll start from here. The money will, the vault comes out of, the dollar would come out of here, be lent down to the firm sector. The firm would then pay part of that as interest to the safe, but also use part of it to pay wages to the workers. The part paid by the wages to the workers would then be spent by the workers in consumption, which goes back to the firm. And the banks don't make the teller machines. The firms do. The banks don't run the brothels. Well, maybe they do. Okay, but they've got to pay to the brothel madam first of all, etc., etc. So if they want to do anything, they have to ultimately consume it. You're talking about a very important distinction, actually, Aaron. You're saying leakage out of the system, like the money falls out into like water into the desert and evaporates. You'd have to have a sink in the system, or a place where the money stopped circulating, to have it breaking down. Now, the fundamental thing about money is it circulates. If you have any other commodity, it ultimately wears out. Money, certainly now we're talking electronic money, well, never has to wear out, always circulates. So I'm talking about a circulatory system, and not understanding that is where a lot of the errors come from, including believing that banks can't actually spend. Yep, third point.
So third point is the bankers.
Yeah.
If the bankers in this model, if you change the model so that the bankers consume as little as possible, so they just consume food, for example.
Okay.
And that causes the model to become more like the original model, because now the firms aren't bringing in the money that they need. And Tom would be correct in that if there was one person that just kept on taking in the money and never spent anything, that they would crash the system.
I'm going to put 100 years as the length of time it takes the banks to turn over their accounts. And play it again. Pardon?
They never turn over the account.
Well, if they never spend it, it will turn up in the safe. I certainly regard bankers as stupid, but not that stupid.
No, it doesn't end up in the safe. It ends up back in the vault, and they make new loans.
No, it doesn't. In this system, they have nothing left in the vault. They don't. I haven't actually included the feedback from the banks to pay the debt. Okay, to get back in the vault, loans have to be repaid, which I'm not showing yet. The system will still work. It will have different dynamics, different final outcome level. In fact, what you can see, the safe is growing very, very slowly. Actually, I've made it too fast. They're spending too quickly in that particular model. Went the wrong way. Should have made it close to zero. But let's just stop this for a second. Okay. What I want to now include is, I'll just change that constant back to the original value. I've got them turning over two. Went the wrong direction over two. I made it turning over spending every 3 days rather than every 100 years as I meant to do there. Okay. Let's now add the next stage of saying they repay debt. So there's going to be a transfer in this case now from the firms to the vault. And having made that transfer, the bank has to record the loan's gone down by that amount. Okay? Let's save this one. Now I have to define F again. And I'll make F proportional, I'll call it repay, the repay rate, given how much is currently outstanding in loans. And having done that, give it a value. And if I use the up and down key, I can actually type a fraction here. Make it 1/7. That actually translates to the banks repaying their loans over a 7-year period. Save that. Come back over here. Shut these windows down. Generate the new diagram. Stuffed over here. And now what I've got coming back is the repayment. You can see it's being added in the system there. So as well as being given a loan, there's now a circuit occurring between here and the vault. Let's play that. And what you will now see, all the systems stabilise. The vault heads down as before, but rather than hitting 0, it tapers off when the rate of repayment equals the rate of new lending. And I can illustrate that. I'll just check and see what the options are at the moment here. Let's see. Okay. Currently the valves are showing the total amount that's passed through the system. So far, the amount passed through has been 104, 107, 109 million. Okay. I should have the years being shown. I haven't actually done. Actually, you can see that's over a 5-year period. So they're turning over the amount of money in the account about every 4 years. Now, if I show the rates of flow once it starts to stabilise, notice how the valves, the amount of money in the valves is growing all the time. If I show the rates of flow, that's showing the annual flow through rather than the total amount over the whole number of years. And you see that's totally stabilising. And what you're getting out of it, I can now show you some income elements to the system. Because wages, with $100 million in the system, wages are working out at about $255 million a year. So the $100 million worth of loans is generating $250 million worth of loan income for the workers in the economy, which they're spending at the pub and probably some also at the brothel, if they save up enough. The bankers are doing plenty of their spending as well. The bankers are being paid $3.9 million a year, and they're consuming pretty much the same level. I haven't got any accumulation going on here. Now, I can include accumulation as well. Okay, that's just simply saying the absolutely simplest system. Accumulation, speculation, all this sort of stuff can be added later. It's just starting the simplest possible system because people's arguments about the sustainability begin from the simplest system. And so if you charge interest, you can't repay it without going bankrupt. Now, I'm showing you can. And on that we'll go indefinitely. So let's stop that one there. I'm going to go to a more complicated model, and I'll just load that before I go on to the next part of the presentation. Pardon me. I'll go here. So it's viable. Banks for capitalists can borrow money, make a profit, repay the debt. I haven't shown you what their profit is yet. I'll do that in a moment. So I've worked out what wages are quite obvious. The flow of money out of the firm's account is the wage level. You can see the interest being earned by the bank as well. I'm not including the bank paying deposit interest, but they can do that as well and still come out with a net positive. That's easy to add just by adding and paying deposit interest on the amount of the money in the firm's account and the worker's account. But profits are more complicated. And what it really comes down to is the economy is productive. It's generating a physical surplus. And that physical surplus goes in one of two directions. Either the workers get it as wages or the owners of the firms get it as profits. So that's the total sum of incomes as wages plus profits. Now, the wages share, as I said, represents the share they got of it, taking into account how rapidly the money turns over. So that W I used a moment ago is a compounding of two things. It's the share that workers are getting divided by how often in a year the amount of money in the economy turns over. So I've currently got that total by being equal to the number 4. Well, that could mean that workers are getting 75% of output, and it turns over a bit more rapidly than once every 3 months. And that would explain that value. Therefore, what capitalists are getting is 1 minus what the workers are getting, in that share divided by the same ratio. So if I had workers getting 75% of total income out of the system, and that would come out in this model, as you can see, to, let's just, okay. I should go back and load that model again a bit late. But workers are getting about $255 million a year out of the system. Capitalist profit would be about $80 million a year, out of which they had to pay interest on the loan, which is a bit less than $100 million a year. So they'd be making something like about $75 million a year net profit. Bankers are making $5 million, and workers are making $280 million in wages. So you get positive incomes for all classes. It doesn't have to break down, but obviously capitalism does. So what's going on there? One thing Erin asked me to add into the presentation here is something about the paradoxical nature of some of the behaviours that we think are sensible when we don't think in terms of the levels of feedback that I'm showing existing in that system. So one thing we often think is it'd be better if we saved more. We often think improving saving is a good idea. Now, you're going to have to take my word for it because this is showing exactly that same model with some additional sophistication in the flowchart software that engineers designed, that I've used for many years. But the account dynamics are simply impossible to understand. This is the capitalist. Remember, by the way, when I showed you the QED model, if I bring up the Godley table, this particular more complicated model, just looking in that bit there, I can explain all of that to you. I can say there's compounding the interest, there's servicing, there's recording the servicing, there I've got debt financed investment going on here, so you get more money in your account and your loan rises at the same amount. There's paying wages, interest being paid to firms on deposit accounts, ditto to workers. It's easy to explain that. You can follow the steps. If I try to explain this to you, I wouldn't want to. Okay? It's just too complicated to follow the dynamics. That's why the account paradigm I'm using makes it possible for this software to be used by economists, whereas this sort of stuff, which engineers find useful, can't really be modelled effectively. It can't be used effectively to model financial dynamics. But anyway, that's an aside, but it is the same model as I've shown you there. And what I've now got in this model, is because the software has features that I would like the other version to have, but it doesn't, I'm using this particular program to illustrate the same idea. And what I'm going to show here is run the model first of all, and the top line is total income, which is the sum of wages plus profits. It's not including interest, by the way. Interest is not part of net income. It's a transfer. So wages plus profits are total income in the economy. Now, the workers' consumption rate is shown over here as a variable, and I'm going to say, let's imagine workers think they want to save more money. Okay? Sounds like a good idea. So they save more money. Look what happened to total income. It goes down. Let's say workers want to spend more money. Total income goes up. Okay? They're changing the rate of circulation of money in the system. And that has... Pardon?
What does that mean for employment?
It would mean, given that with the wage rate I've got here, employment would rise. If you increase the rate of turnover in a monetary system, which workers can do by spending more money more rapidly, that can actually cause employment to rise. There are different results come out of a dynamic way of thinking, can come out of the static way that neoclassical economists have hammered into the population and themselves. And this is what Keynes tried to communicate in what he called the paradox of thrift. Okay? But this is now demonstrating it dynamically. I could do many more demonstrations than that. That's a reasonable one to show. If the rate of relending decreases, take longer to repay the money.
What form do savings take?
Pardon?
What form do the savings?
Savings effectively are residual. It's simply saying you consume less rapidly. So rather than spending your wages on a fortnightly basis, you try to save something out of your wages. So you try to consume on a monthly basis. You try to make 2 weeks' wages last 4.
Is that note stuffed in the mattress?
No, it's in a bank account where you're earning interest and so on, and spending it.
What is the bank doing with those savings?
Pardon?
What is the bank doing with your savings?
The banks don't control the savings, or what you spend out of the savings. You're thinking in terms of the money, of the reserve theory of how money is created, which is also false. We'll have to talk about that later.
I'm just saying, what does the bank do with the money that you deposit in your savings?
They pay you interest on it.
Yeah, and it just sits there in the vault or what?
No, it's not in the vault, it's in your account. Again, this is the 19th century system. They've got the money there and they're compounding it, they're recording it's there, they've got to put more money in because when they pay you, when you put a deposit in the bank says we'll give you 3% interest. So the bank has to pay that interest out of the safe.
Yeah, but the bank isn't just letting that money sit idle, they're using it, they're making loans with it, aren't they?
They're making loans out of the vault, not out of the safe, not out of the... They lend out, in this 19th century model, they lend out of the vault. They can't lend out of the deposits. Okay? I better move on from that point. But you get the paradox of thrift coming out of that. By trying to save more money, you actually slow the economy down.
Steve?
Pardon?
How did he state the paradox of thrift? What does it say? What does the paradox of thrift say?
It says that attempting to save more money can lead to the level of economic output declining and therefore your level of total savings falling.
So if the president said we all need to save more money, the effect would be...
What that would cause is the economy to fall down, to reduce output and end up with less savings.
And if the president said you need to go out and spend...
Then you could get you get an increase in output and more savings coming out of it. There are many other issues inside that in terms of whether the money leaks off to China rather than being used locally, whether it's used for investment than consumption, whether used to speculate on, which is a bad thing, etc., etc. Okay? But if the feedbacks in a complex dynamic system, which is what capitalism is, make it impossible to have that simple linear logic, let's save more money. Because if you save it, you're going to have feedback effects that you're not anticipating, which means stores get less customers coming through, so stores find they can't support the number of staff they have, so they sack a few workers, and those few workers can't save anymore because they haven't got any income, and off you go. And it's not thinking about those complex issues that where's a huge amount of the errors we make in the economy come from. Yeah?
You don't have a slider for productivity here yet, do you?
No.
Where you could actually move it down?
Yeah, I could vary all that or change the level of productivity and so on. That could all be fed. So that's the paradox of thrift. Now, I'm going to now show you the reasons for crashes, beginning of the reasons for crashes. And this is with a model which doesn't have explicit money in it yet. It's just implicitly having money there by having debt. So what I've added here is that with the previous model I showed you in this particular software package, I didn't have banks in the system. And I had firms investing all their profits. Now, in reality, firms invest more than their profits during a boom and less than their profits during a slump. Okay? The level of investment is related to the rate of profit. So the high rate of profit, their expectations are positive, they invest. When the low rate of profit, expectations are low, they don't invest. And this has actually been empirically confirmed by the people who gave us the piece of nonsense known as the efficient markets hypothesis of all people, doing empirical work into the relationship between debt and investment. This is Fammer and French, and they concluded in an empirical research paper that debt is the residual variable in investment decisions. They said investment increases debt and profit reduces it. Okay? So they said the rate of change of debt is investment minus profits. And then investment itself depends upon the rate of profit. So with a high rate of profit, investment will exceed profits. With a low rate of investment will be less than profits. In the former case, you take on more debt. In the latter case, you pay the debt you have down. So I simply add that to the model here. And you'll now see what I've got is, as well as having the capital to output, to employment, to wages relationship, I've also got interest over here. And that's saying given a rate of profit, you then have a rate at which you'll change the level of debt you have in this economy. You then have to multiply debt by the interest rate to work out what interest payments you have to pay. And I'm also making it possible to vary the initial conditions in this model. So I'm going to start, with reasons I'll explain in a moment, with a lower initial population level, which is just a way of manipulating the initial unemployment level. And just to make sure the system can be seen in reasonable time, I'll run it, say, 1 year every 5 seconds, 5 years every 1 second. If I simulate this model, now looking at the rate of growth, and notice the rate of growth is even more up and rapidly down than it was in the previous model. What I've got though is the share that workers are getting in the employment rate cycling, but obviously heading towards an equilibrium. Okay, the system is converging to an equilibrium. And so is the level of debt. In fact, what I'm getting in this model is negative debt, which in this model implies a positive bank balance for firms, and it's going to come out being roughly equal to annual GDP, so it comes out to being roughly a number of 1, which is saying the amount of money firms have accumulated is about 1 year's worth of GDP. So this is a model which, if you're close to the equilibrium, it's stable.
Steve, could you just remind us, what is this model showing again?
This is now the beginnings of a Minsky model. I've simply added into that cyclical model of capitalism that Goodwin gave us the fact that firms invest depending upon the rate of profit, and when the desire to invest exceeds the amount of money they've actually made as profit, they've got to borrow money from the banks. Okay? So it's again, a structural way of bringing Minsky's model in, where Minsky says this sort of system can break down. Now clearly it doesn't break down. That's heading towards an equilibrium output, level, rate of growth, etc., all nice and stable. But I'm going to change the initial conditions where population starts from. And what I want you to take a look at is the debt to output ratio over here. I'll run that again at a stable level and focus just upon the debt to output ratio. And you get a series of cycles in debt to output, which first of all goes positive. So banks are now owing about 60% of GDP, which is actually the level that firms are currently operating at. But then, through the booms and the slumps, they're paying their debt down and actually getting to the stage where they have a effectively positive bank balance, negative debt. Now I'm going to change this so the system is exactly the same, except starting with a different number of workers and therefore a different unemployment rate. And let's take a look at the dynamics this time round for the level of debt. And you can see debt is ratcheting up in a series of humps over time. Looks like it's stabilising at about 200% of GDP, sort of. And what's going on here? You're getting bigger and bigger dooms in the amount of debt being taken on, bigger and bigger cycles. And if I keep on going for long enough, you get a total breakdown. So if firms are too euphoric here about the amount of investment they'll take on, that ratcheting up effect I mentioned yesterday, where they borrow money during booms, have to repay during slumps, and then the whole process starts again. Each time it starts from a higher level of debt, and ultimately you get a total breakdown of the economy. The amount of debt taken on is more than the economy can finance, and it collapses. If I show you the employment, what's happening with employment, then you get employment ultimately plunging. So that's a very stylized version of what we've gone through most recently.
Can you review the assumptions that lead to that situation?
If I had 10 hours, I could, but I've only got this short time, so we'll talk about that over a drink if you like. But it's showing one thing about complex systems, and this is one thing, again, economists don't understand. Because they work with this linear belief about how systems function, they think that a system must head towards equilibrium, because if it doesn't, it'll break down in the sense that you'll get ridiculous values for systems. But a complex system can have cycles without breaking down, which is the first bit I showed you, or it can go to another state where you do get chaos and breakdown. And that's what's actually going on there. So complex systems have much richer behaviours than economists understand are possible for the mathematical models. Now, what I've shown you is a model of Minsky that's implicit. It doesn't have real money. It's implicitly got money in terms of having debt there, but I don't actually have cash circulating. And what I've been trying for my whole academic career is to get to the point where I literally have a strictly monetary model of capitalism. So I've managed to do that. And the link between the two systems is fundamentally the price system. So what I bring in, and again, if I had lots of time, I think I better start winding down here. To have,
I think our brains are about.
yeah. What prices fundamentally do is enable the physical surplus in production to be turned into a monetary profit. And when I work out into a price equation, I start from the argument of saying that if you're going to have equilibrium applying in the system, that means the flow of new demand in terms of physical units being demanded per unit of time would be equal to the physical flow of supply per unit of time. Working through those equations, I finally conclude that the price is going to be a markup on the monetary cost of production, where that markup reflects the amount of output going to capitalists. Okay? So prices are a markup on the cost of production. That's very simple, but it actually works in a dynamic model. Economists don't think it can function. I can show you the algebra to show that it does. So I then bring in prices adjusting, explicitly trying to reach equilibrium, as neoclassicals think they do, but in a dynamic framework where you have prices being set out of equilibrium, and then see what happens. So that's what's being done in this rather more complicated model here. Let's just get that out of the way. So now what I've got is the Minsky model I've shown you with explicitly with money. So I now can talk about inflation, deflation, etc., etc. And I define those, by the way, change of consumer prices. I'm not using the definition Nicole suggested yesterday, and I'll debate that with Nicole when I see her again. She doesn't seem to be here. Must have gone. But this is now a complete monetary model of Minsky. And I'll bring up the second graph here. And one thing I better start with a prelude is that when I did my first model of Minsky and I got that effect of a period of cycles leading to breakdown, when I did the first model, the cycles started off very extreme and then stabilized and then started to grow again on the other side and leading to breakdown. And at the end of the first paper I wrote about, there was chaotic dynamics behind that, and it's actually called the inverse tangent route to chaos. But I then wrote a little rhetorical flourish saying that the chaotic dynamics in this paper should warn us against regarding a period of stability in capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. Thank God I was rhetorical, because that's exactly what happened, because you had what neoclassical economists called the Great Moderation, when the rates of inflation and unemployment appeared to be heading down, both of them heading down to a nice stable equilibrium, and they started congratulating themselves for bringing about what they called the Great Moderation, courtesy of their really wonderful monetary policy. You'll find papers by Ben Bernanke saying pretty much precisely that. From my point of view, this was just the lull before the storm, and what they were ignoring was the rising ratio of debt to GDP, which would eventually cause a breakdown. Well, this model actually generates both the Great Moderation and the Great Depression that we're now in a more extreme form, because I don't allow bankruptcy in this model. You really need bankruptcy to get capitalism out of a depression. So in this particular situation, when you have more money than you can repay, the bank just keeps on compounding the debt. So the debt goes exponential. It doesn't have the potential to turn down as it can in an actual economy. Well, let's simulate this one. And if you're a neoclassical economist, you'd be looking in the top left-hand graph and saying, look, unemployment and inflation are both cycling down. Isn't it great? Our monetary policy is working. And growth is getting more stable. The rate of growth and the rate of profit are both stabilizing. And workers are getting less wages, but who cares about them anyway? What you're ignoring is what's happening over here. Rising level of debt compared to GDP. Nominal debt being paid down, but the GDP falling faster below you. You're no longer in a Great Moderation, you're now in a Great Depression. And I'll run that more slowly again. It's very fast like that. Let's start it again. Let's stop, rewind and play it again. So those cycles in employment and work and inflation, yes, they're dampening. What's happening over here, though, is the ratio of debt to GDP is slowly rising, and the blue line goes through the red line, which means you've got 100% of GDP as your debt level, and then up here 120, 130, 140. Debt continuing to rise for that ratcheting up effect that I mentioned earlier in the other model, and getting to the stage ultimately where it can't be serviced by the firms as well as paying wages. They're accumulating more debt to pay the debt they currently owe. And you then get GDP starting to decline while the debt continues to rise. Ultimately, they do manage to start paying the nominal amount of debt down, but GDP is falling faster, so the ratio goes through the roof, and you're in a Great Depression. In this particular system, because there's no bankruptcy, there's no way out, goodbye capitalism. Now, again, this is a stylized model, but again, that's the sort of behaviour we see on a periodic basis. When I showed you that debt to GDP ratios for America, that's what we had in the Great Depression. We got out of it. We let the bankers out of the cage again after the 1945 period. They got us back into debt. We're back in the same dilemma once more. Now, that the crashes fundamentally in the real model, this is a stylized model again, the crashes come down to Ponzi schemes, because the only way to talk into taking on that much debt is to get us to borrow money not for the basis of income, but for the basis of speculation on asset prices. And that is, when you borrow that money, that is unproductive. If you borrow money and gamble on assets prices, you're not increasing the productive capacity of the economy, and therefore you will lead to a crash. But if you borrow money and it's investing, it'll lead to cycles, but it won't necessarily lead to a crash. And that's why I think we've got to constrain the willingness the public has, both households and corporations, to take on debt and restrain that to taking on for income-related purposes rather than taking it on for gambling and speculation on asset prices. That'll do me. That's your crash course.